And really, you look at it through the lens of this model, they would have been much better off had they kept Chrysler separate and have taken Daimler's resources and plugged them into Chrysler's processes and profit model. And I think it would have been a much more successful rather than a tragic outcome. Yes?
Using this diagram, could you talk about what I think is going to call the publishing business, what I will now call the content business, and the confluence of old media companies and
Yeah, can you just talk a little bit, or give us some specific examples about that so everybody can frame it? Because I think it's a great example of what's...
Well, you know, I go back to your time frame of the 70s and 80s. There was...
That was a real insult, but... Go ahead.
There was this very dignified industry called publishing. They published books.
Yes.
There was another sort of more rambunctious business called television, which came out as radio, and they created programs. There was yet another industry called the film industry out in Hollywood. They created movies. And what has happened in the last 2 years is this wanted confluence or convergence of technologies into or of these businesses with very different profit models, with very different processes, I think,
Yes.
into a unified business that is called content. And so the question is, are newspapers dead? Is television dead? Are there, the gentleman who talked about the telephony having the 7 levels, are there 7 levels or some mysterious number of levels of content?
Yes. Great question. We'll be able to answer it a little bit better after the break, because I want to talk about market segmentation a bit. But the answer is, if these folks don't change, they really are dead. So in the content space, the newspapers are getting disrupted in major cities by the Metro, you know, the free handout. And the revenue side is disrupted by direct mail, Craigslist, Auto Trader, you know, all of those things just niching up the real profitable sources of revenue. Some of the newspapers have set up online kind of separate companies. And most of those, if they've separated them out, are actually very profitable. The Knight Ridder got sold despite the fact that they have a $1.5 billion online news business that's growing 50% a year. But the stock price had been hammered by the prospects that the newspaper itself is dead. So, and you're right, the different media compete with each other for the same job that customers are doing. So I'd like to come back to that when we think about customer segmentation. One more question, and then, Jim, should we break now, or do you want to break at 10:30? What's best? 10:20. 10:20. Okay, one more question, I'll go on.
Can you share with us your thoughts on not so much resource allocation as opposed to resource recycling? What I mean by that is go from core, give you a better than open core, as compared to content, which is really a lot of
Yeah.
ability is a little bit of resources, but the content part or back and forth, that's very important.
His question really relates to a book that Jeffrey Moore wrote about what's core and what's context. Could I defer that to the next point? Because the dilemma is that what's context today becomes core tomorrow, and what's core today becomes context tomorrow, okay? If you guys need to, so we'll go for about another 20 minutes. If you need a bladder break or you're tired, put your head down on the table or just leave. I'd like to just go to another model that really relates to this core versus context, and it's a way of thinking about outsourcing. If you go back, now I may have juggled the order of this a little bit here, but these slides are somewhere in the flow. Page 2? Okay. If you go, where this question arose was, I read an article in Business Week a number of years ago that just lambasted the idiots that ran the IBM personal computer business in Florida in the early 1980s. Is what they had done is, yes, they set up a separate business unit, but then IBM had better operating system technology than Microsoft did and better processor technology than Intel did. And yet they chose to outsource those two things so that they could stay in the slice in the value chain, which is design and assembly of a computer. And in the process of doing that, they stayed at the place where nobody could make any money subsequently, and they put into business the two companies that subsequently made all the money in the industry. And weren't these guys dumb? Was the theme of the article. The reason it bothered me so much is I remember when IBM made those decisions that every wise consultant and business school professor in the world viewed it as bold and brilliant and visionary. And now the graduates of the Harvard Business School are working for consulting firms, running around telling everybody they should outsource everything that's not their core competence. And it just made me wonder how many of today's seemingly wise outsourcing decisions history would prove to have been similarly flawed. And it turned out that this way of thinking about how technological progress interacts with customers' ability to use the progress is really quite helpful. So if you go back in the early years of any industry's history, during this era when the performance of the products aren't good enough for what customers need, the way you have to compete is by making the best possible products. In order to compete that way, to make the best products possible, almost always the architecture of the products is proprietary and interdependent in character. And a good way to visualize what I mean by interdependent is, in the early years of the mainframe computer industry, you couldn't have existed as an independent supplier of operating systems, because that had to be interdependently designed with the logic circuitry, nor could you independently design logic circuitry because that had to be interdependently designed with the storage system, which had to be interdependently designed with the application software, which had to be interdependently designed with the operating system. You know, it was a big hairball. And you just had to do everything in order to do anything. And you did it in an interdependent way because the product didn't perform well enough. And so you just needed to knit the pieces of the system together in the most efficient way possible to get the most performance out of the technology that was available. If they had tried to independently make the pieces of the system and then plug them together according to industry standard modular interfaces, the standardization of the architecture by these interfaces would take so many degrees of freedom away from the engineers that it would have forced them to back way off the frontier of what's possible. And when the performance isn't good enough, you can't afford to back off the frontier. So that means you have to do everything to do anything, and there's a big advantage to being an integrated company during this era when the performance of the product is not yet adequate. But of course, it then begs the question, what happens when these folks make a product that becomes too good for what these folks need? How do you then compete to win the business of the customers down there? The answer is that you have to compete differently. And now, whereas up here speed to market didn't matter all that much, down here speed to market matters a lot. Up here, the economics of an interdependent or proprietary architecture makes customization very expensive. But down here, the ability to customize now begins to matter a lot. It's innovations in speed and convenience and customization that help disruptive competitors get traction down here. In order to compete that way, to be fast and flexible and responsive, the architecture of the product has to evolve from a proprietary interdependent one into an open modular architecture. And modularity enables you to upgrade one piece of the system without having to redesign everything, and you can mix and match and plug and play best-of-breed components to give every customer exactly what they need. When that architecture has become modular, you don't have to be integrated anymore. You just do one piece of the system, so the industry then disintegrates. Now, in the project we did at Intel, Andy Grove and I constructed this chart that plots the rough stages in the value-added process of designing and building and selling a computer. During that industry's first 2 years, or first 2 decades, it was just dominated by vertically integrated companies because you had to be integrated given the way you competed at the time. And even Apple was a significantly integrated company. Just think back in the early years of personal computers. Do you remember how much better the Apples were than the IBMs? These things were clunky and inconvenient and crashed all the time. The Apples were just elegantly simple. And that's because in the early years, when the product wasn't good enough, in many ways, the performance penalty associated with open architecture caused IBM to prematurely follow that open modular strategy. And Apple, with its carefully knit together optimized architecture, dominated the industry. Then when things got good enough, then the advantages of modularity in terms of cost and speed kicked in, and the industry disintegrated. And it was like when they disrupted it, it was like you ran the whole industry through a bologna slicer. And it came to be dominated by a horizontally stratified population of specialized companies rather than a vertically integrated group. And I think you see a similar thing beginning to happen. It already happened in the banking industry as it's been sliced up, as credit scoring and asset securitization have disintegrated the banking industry. But even in pharmaceuticals, you can start to see it getting sliced up. Whereas in the past, being a vertically integrated provider was really very critical. Now, a funny thing happens when an industry goes through this transition, and that is that the place in the value chain where attractive profits can be made flips. So here in the upper left, when the product isn't good enough and you're living in a world of proprietary architecture, the money is made by the companies that control the architecture. So if we went back to the early years of an IBM computer, the way you designed these computers, there was only about 100 people in the whole world who could design a computer, and IBM employed most of them. And the way the design process worked is these experts would build a prototype, test it, find it wouldn't work. And so they'd have to scratch their heads, change things, test it again, it wouldn't work. They'd scratch their heads more. Most of them were bald. And it wouldn't work, but they just iterate towards a design that ultimately worked. Nobody could play that game like these experts at IBM. The performance of the product wasn't determined by the components from which the computer was made. It was determined in the way the components were knit together in the architecture. So IBM had a 70% market share. They made 95% of the industry's profit. Back when automobiles were on the left-hand side of the world, the design of a car worked in the very same way as the design of a computer, and that was by building and testing prototypes and iterating towards something that would work. General Motors had a 55% market share. They made 80% of the industry's profit. If you were a component supplier to IBM or General Motors, you just lived a miserable profit-free existence year after year because the components didn't make the difference. It was the architecture that made it. And you can see in that light why the IBM people decided to outsource the microprocessor and the operating system, because in this world, the components didn't make a difference. It was the architecture that did. But when you get to the other side of the world, then where the money is made flips. And a good way to visualize that is just imagine that you were a design engineer for Compaq and your boss said, I want you to go design a better computer for me than Dell makes. How would you do this? Because the architecture of the computer is now standardized. And the only way to make a better computer is to put in a faster microprocessor, more gigabytes on the disk drive, the latest operating system. And what drives the ability of these customers to move up market against them is what's inside, not what's outside. And so the ability to make money then flips to the components and the subsystems. And the commoditization process reverses itself. So on the left-hand side, it was the customer who commoditized the supplier. On the right-hand side, it's the supplier that commoditizes the customer. And let me just walk you through a couple of these histories to help you visualize it. So Compaq finds itself over here as an assembler of modular computers, can't differentiate its product anymore. And Wall Street starts to put the screws on these poor guys to get their returns up. How are they going to get the returns up? Well, they can't do it by premium pricing because the product is undifferentiable. And so the only way they can do it is to get costs down or get assets off the balance sheet. So Flextronics starts out as just a little circuit board making company in Singapore, and they're making the little boards that Compaq uses. Flextronics comes back to Compaq and they say, you know, we've been doing a good job on the little boards. How about you let us make the motherboard? Because circuit manufacturing really isn't your core competence, and we could do it for 20% lower cost. So Compaq's analysts looked at it and decided, gosh, they could. And if we gave that to them, we could get rid of all of the circuit manufacturing assets, which were very capital intensive. And so they handed that off to Flextronics. Compaq's revenues were unaffected, but its profitability really took a snap up. And Wall Street, as you know, loves margins. Flextronics' revenues improved. Their profitability improved because they're utilizing their assets better. And as you know, Wall Street loves asset utilization. And then Flextronics came back. You know, we've been making the motherboard, doing a good job. It's really the guts of the computer. Why do you need even to bother to assemble the rest of the computer? Because assembly isn't your core competence, and we could do it for 20% lower cost. Compaq's analysts looked at it and decided, gosh, they could. And if they did, we could get rid of all the other manufacturing assets on the balance sheet. And so they hand that over. Compaq's revenues are unaffected, but their profitability looks better because they got 20% out of a big chunk of costs. Wall Street gives their stock a nice pop. Flextronics' revenues improve again. Their profitability improves. Wall Street loves this stock they've discovered in Singapore. And then Flextronics comes back. You know, we've been assembling the computer for you. Why do you need even to bother with managing the dumb supply chain, dealing with the stupid component suppliers, managing all these logistics headaches, shipping the products to the customers? Logistics isn't your core competence, and we could manage that for 20% lower cost. Compaq's analysts looked at it and said, geez, they could. And if they did, we could get all the current assets off the balance sheet. So they shoveled that over. Compaq's revenues are unaffected, but their profitability improves, especially return on assets because they got no more assets. And as you know, Wall Street loves asset-light companies. Flextronics' revenues improve again, and their profitability now starts to look really good because they're getting into value-added services. And as you know, Wall Street loves value-added services companies. So their stock gets a nice pop. And then Flextronics comes back. You know, we've been managing this supply chain for you. Why do you need even to bother to design the dumb computer? Because it's really component selection more than anything else, and we've got those relationships with the component suppliers. It's not your core competence. We could do it for 20% lower cost. And Compaq's analysts looked at it and decided, geez, they could, and if they did, we could fire all of our engineers and get our costs down even lower because our core competence really is our brand after all. And so they shovel that over. Revenues are unaffected, costs improve even more. Flextronics' revenues improve again, and then Flextronics comes back one more time, except this time they don't go back to Compaq, but they go to Best Buy. And say, you know, here we are, a fully integrated manufacturer and designer of some of the best computers in the world. Why do you need even to bother to carry that dumb brand Compaq on your shelf? Because branding is, you know, you want branding to be your core competence, not theirs, and we'll make products that are our brand or yours, you choose. And very quickly, as the supplier kept taking into itself progressively more difficult problems, they were trivializing the remaining value that Compaq had to add, commoditizing their customer until there was nothing left. And you notice I was able to tell the whole story without ever using the word stupid manager once. Because there's no stupidity on either side of the equation. In fact, had Compaq not outsourced, they would have been killed a lot sooner, but because they did outsource, they were killed later. I think it's probably a more difficult dilemma than is the innovator's dilemma on the disruption chart, because you could say that what Compaq really needed to do was they could not avoid outsourcing. They had to do that in order to get their costs continuing to fall. But they should have owned Flextronics separately and let Flextronics grow up as a progressively more asset-intensive business, even as Compaq became an asset-light business. And that wouldn't necessarily have satisfied Wall Street's appetites for return on asset improvement, but it would have allowed them to catch the growth that was inherent in that business, even while they hollowed out the core business. But what became valuable flipped as they went through that process. And in many ways, what Intel did was it commoditized its customers. So you remember over here how the expertise of the people that designed computers was really the core engine of profitability. Well, when Intel first began to sell its chip, it solved many of IBM's problems on the processor. But it still took a lot of electrical engineering expertise to design a workable computer around the Intel processor. But starting in the 4th generation, Intel began to sell not just the chip, but they integrated forward and began selling chipsets. And they essentially solved inside of the chipset all of the complicated electrical engineering problems associated with computer design. And I'm going to put my tongue in my cheek here a little bit, but essentially they made it so foolproof and idiot simple that any unwashed electrical engineer with an EE degree from a third-rate Taiwanese university could start a computer company. And hundreds of them did. And competition amongst all of those people drove pricing down, grew the market tremendously, but Intel made all the money because they're the ones that commoditized the customer. Now, I was telling this story at a course I teach every summer at the Harvard Medical School. So I want to get after the break to talk about the disruption of the healthcare industry. There's a woman in the class, it's the deans of other medical schools that come here because we're talking about how does medical education need to change as the industry gets disrupted. And this woman who's a dean at one of the big Midwestern medical schools raised her hand after I told these stories, and she said, I don't think you get this. We're doctors, and we train doctors. Are you somehow suggesting that doctors are going to get commoditized? And I was chicken to answer. She had a really menacing look on her face. And so I said, well, what do you guys think? And of course, they just hurled epithets at me at the very suggestion that this could happen. But there was one guy who stood up in the classroom and he raised his hands. He was the associate dean at the University of California at San Francisco. And he raised his hands and he said, you guys be quiet. If you don't think doctors can get commoditized, just look at me. I've been commoditized. And he went on to describe how he's an orthopedic surgeon by training. And he said, you know, 30 years ago when we were doing the pioneering hip and knee replacement surgery, the ability to do that was really resident in the intuition, experience, and skill of the finest orthopedic surgeons in the world. And nobody could play that game like us. As evidence to how important we were, we, the surgeon, generally got 60 to 70% of the non-hospital portion of the bill. And then he said, but those stupid implant makers, every year as they've improved that implant, they've made it ever more foolproof and idiot simple, so that today any unwashed orthopedic surgeon operating in a third-rate community hospital can do a perfect implant every time. I've been commoditized. And he said as evidence of how much they've trivialized, I mean that's a bit of an overstatement, but trivialized the remaining value that the surgeon has to add, said this year for the first time the implant makers are getting about 55% of the non-hospital portion of the bill, and us poor surgeons are lucky to get 25%. Then another thing has happened, or is beginning to happen, by which diagnostics manufacturers, I believe, have the opportunity to commoditize physicians. And this, I think, is a tremendous growth opportunity for certain parts of the pharmaceutical industry, even though in the past the diagnostics business has been a dog business and the therapeutics business has been a gorgeous business. And let me describe what I mean. We thought in the past that leukemia was a disease. And so if you were diagnosed with leukemia, you went to the finest oncologist money could buy. And she'd run a bunch of tests on your blood, go talk to the colleague about the data. They'd embark on a course of therapy. The therapy might or might not work. If it didn't work, they'd confer again, try another course of therapy. That might or might not work. You might die, you might not. But the ability to effectively care for patients with leukemia was really resident in the intuition and skill of the finest oncologists in the world. Well, I have a friend who was one of the founding scientists at a firm in Cambridge called Millennium Pharmaceuticals that's played a key role in the understanding of the human genome. And these guys just published an article that concluded that what we used to think was a disease called leukemia actually isn't a disease at all. But it's an umbrella symptomatic manifestation of 6 fundamentally different disorders, all of which have the same symptom. And these 6 different disorders can be characterized by a unique molecular pathway by which the tumor propagates. And you can tell which of the 6 you have by looking at a pattern in a set of genes. Now, as this technology becomes fully developed and approved by the FDA, when that happens, if I'm worried that I've got a disease like this, I'll go to a technician. And the technician will draw a sample of my blood, look at the pattern in my genes, compare it against this template, and say, Clay, gosh, I'm sorry, you've got number 2. In the past, a standardized therapy for leukemia was not possible because we couldn't diagnose the disease. And so it turns out that the reason why some patients would respond to a therapy and others wouldn't was not that the drug company made a bad batch of drugs on that particular day. It's just they had different diseases, and we didn't know about it. And so it required a lot of judgment to get through that. But now that we know, as soon as we have the ability to precisely diagnose, then a standardized optimized therapy for that precisely diagnosed disorder can be developed and adopted. And from that point on, a technician could provide better diagnosis than an oncologist, and a nurse could provide better therapy than could the doctor. And the diagnostics would then have the effect of commoditizing the physician. And when we think about the dilemmas that we face in the rising cost of healthcare, as I'll get into this after the break, the solution is not to ask doctors to become inexpensive or to ask complicated hospitals to become cheap, but rather it will come by commoditizing the physicians and commoditizing the hospital and facilitating their disruption by lower cost providers and lower cost venues of care. We need to break, so when we come back, I won't talk about, but Bloomberg is commoditized the Wall Street analysts. First Data is commoditizing commercial banks. And I want to talk about how the business schools actually are being disrupted and professors are going to get commoditized.
You started about compacting. This isn't your core competency. That's for you. At what point in that conversation did Compact say, hey, by the way, what are our core competencies? What are the resources and those things that we don't have to source out? Otherwise,
yes.
They might go to you, might be that high.
Yeah, it's a great question. My sense is that their definition of what was their core competence evolved over time to profitable for them in the shortest term. And there wasn't any kind of technological or strategic definition, but their definition was a rationalization to defend whatever seemed to make short-term economic sense. One of the others of you asked a question about Jeffrey Moore, whose stuff I just love, and he has this concept that there are activities in the value chain that constitute context and activities that constitute core. And the rub is that over here in the upper left-hand side, what's core is context over here, and what's context here becomes core over there. So you go back in the history of the IBM's computer business, what was core was the ownership of the architecture, and the components were context that you didn't have to make. And because then they got rid of the context, when they found themselves on the right-hand side, they found that what had been core was now irrelevant, you know. And so it's a tricky thing to the idea that you should always stick with what's your core competence. Is, as long as things don't change, is really a good idea, but maybe a better way to think about it is what activity needs to be our core competence in the future. And that's a better way to think about the problem than we have in the past.
Is it also fair to say that if you're trying to identify the person who has core competence, if you're trying to identify if you have one or what it is, it would also be good the person who knows exactly what core competence is.
That's right. That's right.
Just on that point, to me, IBM's core competence is their ability to manage and service the customer. I think they could make any product in the world and stick it into that customer relationship, and people would buy it from them. I mean, they're selling services now. That's their big thing.
Well, yeah, and that, they've kind of, as the hardware got commoditized and modularized, they went into that. A Jewish friend of mine said that you're kind of the Jewish mother of business, Clay, because you're always worried about things. And I worry that TCS and Infosys are commoditizing even the IBM service business. Sir?
In all of these, you kind of describe that pattern of moving up and everybody's kind of happy. But why don't they see that pattern? What's the block?
Well, we're doing our best. And companies, there are quite a few companies that now see it and catch it and have been really very successful. So in my view, it's like up through the early 1900s, the evidence was just overwhelming that humans couldn't fly. But once people figured out how the world worked, and they could design machines that had these airfoils and got the right amount of drag and resistance to manage the lift, you know, then folks could really fly quite well. So last year, Intel generated 24 billion in revenue that came from ideas out of that work. And Kodak could see in advance that digital is going to disrupt film. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the mistakes they made early, but once they understood it, they came down to the bottom of the market with their Easy Share camera. Now they're the market share leader in digital in the US. Whereas Fuji and Polaroid just didn't see it because they weren't looking for it, and they just got flipped dead. And so there have been quite a few success stories so far, but I want to come to the Harvard Business School so you guys know who to pray for in the future. Somebody in the back had one. I don't see it. Sir?
The experience about somewhat about the ability to heavily regulate industries. In the sense that we're talking about a lot of organizations in industries. I work in the insurance industry, it's very regulated by both the capital perspective and policy perspective. We have similar.
They do. Regulation very often gets implemented to protect the interest of the incumbent leaders. I want to talk about how that's working in healthcare in a bit. But in financial services in general, disruptions are happening all over the place with or without regulation. So in brokerage, for example, Merrill Lynch actually in 1910 started out going after the unwashed masses. And they disrupted all of the brokers that existed on Wall Street through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And now they're at the high net worth end of the market. And they're being disrupted by Charles Schwab, which is being disrupted by Ameritrade and E-Trade and so on. In the lending business, the disruptive technology was computer-based algorithms called credit scoring that are used to make lending decisions. And originally, credit scoring was only used to make the decision whether or not to issue an in-store Sears credit card. That was the first application, down at the bottom of the market. As the algorithms became more sophisticated, you could use them to make credit card credit limit decisions, and then automobile loans, and then home mortgage loans. And now small business loans mostly are made by computer-based algorithm, not the judgment and skill of the world's best loan officers. Now, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about if I've got a new technology that I want to build a growth business around, how can I tell who the right customers are for that new technology? And the odd conclusion that we've reached is that it is actually non-consumers who are the ideal customers for a new technology. So this, to make the argument, is going to complicate the diagram a little bit. So one of the things we've said is that bringing a better product into an established market is not something that I want to do if I'm starting a new business. I'll leave that to the incumbent leaders because they're motivated to win that fight. There are two types of disruption. So one type occurs when somebody just figures out a lower cost way of selling similar products to the existing market. So Walmart was a low-end disruption. Steel mini mills were a low-end disruption. The Celeron chip actually was a low-end disruption. Most disruptions, though, have a different character. We call them a new market disruption. They come out in a third plane of competition. And these occur when an innovator has figured out a way to make a product that historically was so expensive and complicated that only experts with a lot of money had access to the product. Now they figure out a way to make it so affordable and simple that a whole new population of people can now own and use a product. And we call that a new market disruption because it enables the creation of a market that did not exist before and customers who did not exist before. A good way to visualize this is in the early 1990s, there was a company in China called Galans. They were a textile company. Of all of the crazy ideas, they decided they wanted to get into the microwave oven business. So they had these three options. They could try to come into the core market in China as it existed and beat Panasonic at its own game. Probability of success, 0. They could use low-cost Chinese labor to manufacture microwaves for export to the existing developed markets around the world. That probably would have worked until all manufacturing of microwaves had migrated to China, and then they got the mini mill problem of nobody could make money because they're all low cost. The third option was to come out here and create a new plane of competition by competing against non-consumption. That is, make it now so simple and affordable that folks who historically didn't have a big enough wallet to own a microwave oven or a big enough kitchen to have one now could. And that's what they did. They designed a tiny little box that they could profitably market at a $39 price point. And by making it small and affordable, about 100 million more Chinese whose cramped Shanghai kitchen apartments weren't big enough to have a big microwave oven or who couldn't afford it, now they could have one. And it was so much better than nothing, which was their only other alternative, that they were quite delighted with what was a fairly limited product. And once they had a business model that could make money at a $39 price point, then carrying that business model up to a $45 and then a $55 price point, all of the increment in pricing fell to the bottom line, and taking on the rest of the world was just duck soup. So they went from 0 to 40% of the world microwave market in 8 years. And now they're coming back down and doing it in room air conditioners. It turns out that there's a lot of non-consumption of air conditioning in the south of China. And yeah, copiers do the same thing. And that's the way Canon beat Xerox, is making it simple and affordable to have one around the corner from your office. And Xerox didn't see it because Canon's slow personal copiers couldn't be used in high-speed photocopying centers, and then they did it. Into this convenient lower cost plane, and those guys were just left without customers. That's how they got disrupted. Well, there's a propensity amongst the leaders in an industry when a technology becomes available to do this and make things affordable and simple, their propensity instead is to take that technology and cram it into head-on competition with the established approach. It costs hundreds of millions and sometimes billions of dollars, and they always fail. And again, it's a perfectly rational process that leads them there. And I want to just walk you through how that works and then discuss how to address it. The transistor disrupted the vacuum tube. I'll give you a historical example and one that's going on now, and then talk about a couple in the future. In the 1950s and early 60s, consumer electronics were really powered by vacuum tubes, and RCA in northern New Jersey was just the giant of the electronics industry. And the transistor was disruptive because it couldn't handle the power that was required to make TVs and radios at the time. Every one of the vacuum tube companies, this is RCA, Zenith, General Electric, Westinghouse, took a license to the transistor from Bell Labs where it was invented, and they carried the license into their own labs and framed it as a technology problem. In other words, the transistor just can't handle the power required to be used in the market. As a group, as best I can tell, they spent between $2 and $3 billion in today's dollars trying to make the transistor good enough that it would work in the market. Now, while they were working on the problem, out here in a third plane of competition, the first application was a germanium transistor hearing aid. And then in 1955, Sony introduced its pocket radio. Any of you guys with gray hair remember how crummy those Sony radios were? Just static laced. Yeah, you've kept your age pretty well, haven't you? But Sony chose to sell its crummy radio to the rebar of humanity, people we call teenagers. And the teenagers were delighted to have a crummy product because it was infinitely better than their alternative, which is no radio at all. Had Sony tried to sell its crummy radio to the parents, it would have been judged as a crummy radio because it really was relative to what they had. So a booming new market emerged out here, and RCA felt no pain whatsoever. And then in '59, Sony introduced its first portable black and white 12-inch TV. Again, a very limited product compared to the large and elegant things that were made there. But again, Sony chose to compete against non-consumption by making it so much more affordable and simple that a whole new population of people who didn't have an expensive RCA could now have one of these. And it was because it was better than nothing, the customers were just delighted. And so in this third plane of competition, a booming new market emerged, and RCA felt no pain. Interestingly, and this is a very consistent finding across all of these industries, is that a whole new channel to the end-use customer had to be developed out here. As these products were sold through appliance stores, and appliance stores made their money by replacing the burned-out vacuum tubes in the TVs and radios that they had sold. When Sony first began to compete here, they tried to get distribution through appliance stores, but appliance stores wouldn't give them the time of day because they didn't have any vacuum tubes in them that would burn out. But lucky for Sony, Kmart was emerging at the very same time, and Kmart couldn't sell vacuum tube-based products because they couldn't service them. And so you had a product and a channel whose economics were really tuned to each other. And so by the mid-1960s, finally solid-state electronics had gotten good enough that you could start to make big things in solid state. And in 3 years, the customers just got all sucked out of the vacuum tube plane into the solid-state world. And every one of the vacuum tube companies vaporized. And it's a very punishing story, because it's not that the vacuum tube companies lacked vision. They saw transistors coming long before Sony saw them. It's not that they lacked guts. They invested easily 10 times more expense money trying to make the vacuum tube or the transistor work than Sony ever spent making the transistor work. But what's punishing is that they tried to cram the disruptive technology into head-on competition on a sustaining basis with the existing technology in the existing application. The only way these folks would have made their products with solid state rather than vacuum tubes is if solid state were more performance and cost effective in that application at that time. That was, in the 1950s, a very difficult technical hurdle for Sony to overcome, or for RCA to overcome. And Sony, by competing against non-consumption, all they had to do was make a product that was better than nothing, and the customers were delighted. And that was a much more tractable technical hurdle to surmount at the beginning, and then little by little, it just improved. Now, the next time you go to CompUSA, go to the voice recognition software shelf. There will be a box there called the IBM Via Voice. Pick up the box. Don't buy the product, but just look at the box, okay? And there'll be a customer pictured on the box. It's an administrative assistant seated in front of her computer, but instead of typing, she's got a headset on and she's speaking. And as you look at her face, just visualize the value proposition that IBM is making to this woman. Look, I understand you type 90 words a minute, and I know that you type 99% accurately, and I know that whenever you need to capitalize a letter, you just instinctively press shift and keep going. I don't want you to do any of that anymore. Instead, put this headset on. Now teach yourself to speak in a slow and distinct and consistent manner. If you must capitalize a word, simply pause. Carefully speak the command, capitalize, pause. Speak the word you hope to capitalize, pause again. Please be patient with us. We are 70% accurate now. We're working on making it even better. This is not good news to this customer. IBM has spent so far over $600 million trying to make voice recognition technology good enough that people would use it instead of typing. This is a very difficult technical hurdle for IBM to overcome. Now, while they're working on the problem, out here in a third plane of competition, Lego shows up with a toy robot that has a 4-word vocabulary, stop, go, left, and right. And the kids are delighted with the crummy product because none of their toys would ever listen to them before. You know, and then we get standard press or say one or what city and state, you know, and a real market is beginning to emerge out there. I bet the next application is chat rooms because the kids don't spell check or type anyway. They'd rather speak. And maybe sometime voice recognition will get good enough that you can do that sort of stuff. But billions of dollars are spent in the process there, and billions in revenue will have been generated competing against non-consumption. Now, why do you suppose IBM chose to cram this technology into the most forbidding market application that mankind could conceive? You've got to rule out stupidity, because they're at least as smart as us. Well, my guess is, of course, that's the market they play in. But my guess is that one of the core drivers is whoever it was that conceived of this technology couldn't do anything with it unless it got funded. In order to get funded, you've got to develop a PowerPoint presentation, and the top line has a revenue projection. And if you stand up in front of senior management and say, you know, guys, we're going to go after toy robots, 39-cent price point, 8 million units a year, you'd never get funded. But if you say we hired the Gartner Group, paid them $1 million, they did this study that concluded that in typing alone, there's a $10 billion market potential here, then you'd get funded. But the very act of getting funded by demonstrating that an established, proven market exists, then causes you to cram it into the very application that would cause you to fail. And it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? That the seemingly most attractive market is actually the least attractive destination for a new technology to take root. You ever wonder whether voice or whether solar energy is going to make it? This is really an interesting question, isn't it? The US and European governments have so far spent about $15 billion trying to make solar energy good enough that it can be used in North America and Europe. And there are down in the desert a few farms that generate just a tiny fraction of our needs. But for us to ever expect, especially in the Northeast, for solar energy to get good enough that we could put these panels on our roofs and cut the cord to the mainstream generation station, it's a pipe dream. Because our buildings are all air conditioned, we leave the lights on all night, genuine technical problems like night happens every day, clouds get in the way all the time. For solar energy ever to get good enough, billions of dollars are nowhere near enough. And in the midst of all of this wondering, our daughter served as a missionary for our church in Mongolia for a couple of years. And Annie finished the work 2 years ago. It was the only chance we'd ever have to go to Mongolia, so we went over to pick up Annie, and she took us on a tour around the country. In the capital city of Ulaanbaatar, she took us to this mammoth open-air bazaar. And we happened upon a line of vendors there that were just selling dirt-cheap solar panels, where the materials were sputtered on glass rather than silicon wafers. They were shrink-wrapped with rabbit ears antennas and 6-inch black and white TVs, and these things are going out of the market like you can't believe. Well, it turns out that about 40% of Mongolia's population are non-consumers of electricity. They live in these gers that are tents that they just fold up to follow their herds around the countryside. And there's no electricity in the gers. Therefore, none of them are air conditioned. And so what if it was cloudy today? We couldn't watch TV yesterday. So even while we wonder if there will ever be a substantial market for the technology, amongst the 2 billion people in Asia and Africa who are non-consumers of conventional electricity, solar energy is a booming market. And the companies that are serving it are pursuing a fundamentally different paradigm, which is to make it affordable and simple rather than expensive and complicated. And my guess is whether solar energy ever gets traction won't happen from the result of massive DOE grants to our leading universities, but rather just the folks on the ground trying to make a better product, a product that is better than nothing and is affordable to people who didn't have access to the more expensive stuff. And then little by little, it'll pull applications out. Some of you are in the energy business, and do you ever wonder if electric cars are going to make it? Well, California forced a massive cram of battery-powered vehicles onto the California freeways. It just never happened. It's the most demanding market that mankind could conceive. But electric vehicles, or even fuel cell-powered vehicles that come out in this dimension, and for example, the kind of question that you'd want to ask would be, so electric vehicles won't cruise very far without needing recharging, and they won't go very fast for an extended period of time. So where is there a market that would be delighted to have a car that wouldn't cruise far or accelerate very fast? And you just have to ask the question and say, how about the parents of teenagers? They would love a car that wouldn't go very far or cruise very fast. And if you made a car that you could sell at a $5,000 price point, so you could just master charge it, and it wasn't licensed to go on the freeway, but kids could use it to go to school and go see their friends, my guess is that a market would emerge, and little by little, the technology would fall into line. So that's one reason why innovations fail, is that massive amounts of money are spent trying to make new technologies good enough that they can supplant old technologies, as opposed to using the very same technical concept to make a product that is so affordable and simple that a whole new population can play in that market. Now, the last concept I'd like to go over, and then I want to get into healthcare, and then at that point, maybe we can have some more questions, is we decided that the fundamental paradigm that we have been teaching at business schools about how to segment markets is wrong. And it causes most companies, when they introduce products into their markets, to fail. A company like Procter & Gamble, this is quite a shocking statistic, 85% of the new products that they introduce into their markets fail after they've done their market research and test marketed these products. Now, isn't this an interesting puzzle? Because they employ some of the smartest people in the world, and yet they strike out 85% of the time. And what we decided is that if you're inside of a company looking out onto the market, it appears to be structured by product category or by customer characteristics. And so if you look inside of your company at the market segmentation schemes that you use as you measure your market share and define who your competitors are, most companies segment markets by product category or price point or by customer category. And so you've got notebook computers, desktop computers, servers, workstations, BlackBerries, or you've got industry verticals, small, medium, large enterprises, 25 to 45-year-old females with children. You know, these are all common segmentation schemes. And that indeed is what the market looks like when you're in the company looking out. But if you're a customer, that's not what the market looks like at all. The way the customer experiences the market is they just have jobs that arise in their lives that they need to get done. And they hire products or services to do the job for them. And what it means is that if we want to make products that customers will hire when they find themselves needing to do these jobs, the job needs to be the fundamental unit of analysis and not the customer. And let me illustrate this with a silly story about milkshakes. One of the leading fast food restaurant chains wanted to goose up the sales of its milkshake product line. They had very good demographic and even psychographic data on who tended to buy milkshakes. And so they'd buy people who fit those profiles, or they'd hire people who fit those profiles to come into conference settings. And they'd ask them, what can we do to improve the milkshakes so that more of you guys would buy more of them? Would you like it creamier, chocolatier, cheaper, chewier? And they got very good feedback from the customers. They would improve the milkshakes, and it had no impact on sales or profits whatsoever. So one of our colleagues went in with a different mindset. His question was, I wonder what job people hire a milkshake to do. So we stood in a restaurant for 18 hours and just took very careful data on who bought milkshakes. When did they buy them? What were they wearing? Were they alone or with other people? Did they buy other food or only a milkshake? Did they consume it in the restaurant? Did they leave? Well, it turned out that about almost half of the customers bought the milkshake in the early morning. It was the only thing they bought. They were always alone, and they always left the restaurant and drank the milkshake in the car. So he came back the next day and confronted these people as they were leaving the restaurant, milkshake in hand. And in language that they could understand, he essentially said, excuse me, but could you tell me what job you were trying to get done for yourself when you just hired that milkshake? And think about the last time when you needed to get the same job done. You were in the same situation, and you didn't come here to hire the milkshake. What did you hire to do that job? Well, it turned out that they all had a similar job to do, and that was they had a long and boring commute to work. And they just needed something to keep the commute interesting, and they'd do something during the commute. God had given them this extra cup holder that didn't need to be on the wheel, and they needed something to do with that. They weren't hungry yet, but they knew they'd be hungry by 10 o'clock. So they wanted something that would just thunk down in their stomach and stay there for a while. So what do I hire when I need to get this job done? Well, come to think of it, last week I hired a banana to do the job, but it really was crummy. It was gone in 3 minutes. I was hungry by 7:30. The cup holder was still empty. Sometimes I hire donuts, but they get my fingers sticky, and that gets the steering wheel sticky. They go fast. I'm hungry by 8 o'clock. I hire bagels on occasion, but they're dry. They crumb all over my clothes. If I want to put cream cheese or jam on them, then I have to steer with my knees. And then if the phone rings and I'm in big trouble, I hire Snickers bars once in a while, come to think of it, but that makes me feel guilty every time. But let me tell you, when I hire this milkshake, it is so viscous that it takes me 20 minutes to suck it up that thin little straw. And it fits right in that cup holder. And who knows what the ingredients are, but I do know that I'm still full at 10 o'clock. It turns out that the milkshake does the job better than any of the competition. And the competition is not Burger King milkshakes, but it's bananas, donuts, bagels, Snickers bars, and boredom. Because he says a lot of times, I'm just bored and I don't have anything to do the job. And then it turns out that it was hired for a very different job in the evening. And this was hired by parents who have been saying no to their children all day long. And my son says, Dad, can I have a milkshake? And I so badly want to just be nice and feel nice. And so I say, Spence, sure, you can have a milkshake. So it's bought with a meal, with other people, consumed in a restaurant. And you watch what happens is I finish my meal, and then Spence finishes his meal, and then he picks up this milkshake, and it takes forever for that little guy to suck it up that thin little straw. And I wait patiently, and then I wait impatiently, and then I say, come on, Spence, we just got to go, and we throw it away half done. So then they invite me in as a member of the demographic segment that buys milkshakes, and they ask me, so how do we improve the milkshake so you'll buy more of them? What am I going to tell them? Because I hire it for fundamentally different jobs. And then they average my response with all of the other 35 to 55-year-old male slobs with children and come up with a one-size-fits-none product that doesn't do any of the jobs well for which it is hired. But you can easily see that once you understand what that morning job is, what kinds of improvements to the product would get traction with the customer. Because it turns out that they were improving it along dimensions of performance that were irrelevant to the jobs that it was being hired to do. So for the morning job, what would you do? You'd actually want to make it more viscous, wouldn't you? Because it'd take even longer to suck it up the straw. And you'd stir in tiny chunks of fruit, not to make it healthy because they don't hire it to be healthy, but to make the commute interesting. Just at random, you'd suck up a piece of fruit and it would add an air of unpredictability and anticipation to the morning routine. And then you'd move the dispensing machine from behind the counter to the front of the counter and give it a prepaid swipe card system so people could just run in and gas up and go without getting caught behind the swim team in the Suburban in the drive-through lane, you know. And all of a sudden, a product that you thought had overshot was actually not good enough for the job that people were hiring it to do. And if you improve the product on those dimensions of performance that are relevant to the job, it would gain share. Not against Burger King milkshakes particularly, but against bananas, donuts, bagels, Snickers bars, and boredom. As it turns out, almost always that when companies segment the market by the job that customers are trying to get done, they find that the market is actually a lot bigger and their market share is much smaller than they thought because the real competitors aren't in their product category. So how big was that morning job market? If you measure it by the size of the milkshakes that are sold, you just totally miss what the market looks like from the customer's point of view. And that means that the growth potential is greater because almost always non-consumption is a major competitor. And that then allows us to think about what constrains more customers from hiring my product to do that job and compete better against non-consumption. Now, I'd like to just talk a bit about how a brand is built. As what we decided again is that maybe our whole concept of brand advertising is an expensive and broken paradigm. A brand is the way we conceive of the beginning of the building of a valuable brand is that it's a purpose brand. And let me describe what I mean by that. You find yourself needing to get a job done. And once you realize, either subconsciously or consciously, you realize you got to get this job done, the next question in your mind is, what should I hire to do the job? And it starts you on a search process. If no company created a product that was designed to do that specific job, or you're not aware of it, then you just kind of wander around on the game board of life looking for something to hire, and you'll try something, it might not work very well for that particular job, and if it doesn't, you learn to distrust the brand that you just hired. But if somebody's actually created a product that was positioned right on that job, and you use the product and find that it does it well, Then when you land on that job space again and need to do the same thing, the brand of that product will begin to pop into your mind as something that is associated with that job, and we call it a purpose brand, because it tells you what purpose that product or what job that product was designed to do. And so the process by which the purpose brand is built is that I'm sorry, this is really hard to look at from back there. You design a product that does the job well, you give it a brand that uniquely links the product to that job, and then as people hire it to do the job and find that it does the job well, they learn to trust that job for that purpose, and then they begin talking about it to their friends. And then and only then does advertising work in the building of brands. There's a whole set of brands that have been built in the last years that I think most people would say are valuable brands. None of them were built through advertising, but they were all designed through this 5-step process of positioning a product on the job, giving it a brand that links the product to the job. People hire it, find that it does it well, and they begin to trust it. And then they talk about it. So FedEx is a brand, for example. There's a job sitting there on the game board of life for centuries, which is I got to get this from here to there with perfect certainty as fast as possible job. But then nobody had designed a product to do the job well. When FedEx came up with that service, and people then hired it to do the job, found out it did it well, that brand, FedEx, has begun to pop into everybody's mind when they find themselves needing to get that job done, and it becomes a very valuable brand as a result. OnStar, Google, eBay, Starbucks, BlackBerry, Xerox, Kleenex, Lunchables, Hill-Rom, and Crest all are brands that were positioned on a job and earned their trust because of that process. Purpose brands, because it just matches the sequence in which consumers think, I need to do a job, what can I hire, tend to be far more valuable brands than corporate endorser brands. For example, do any of you guys own Milwaukee electric tools? You can see real men own Milwaukee tools, don't they? Very high quality, very high quality tools. And Milwaukee has a full line of tools. On average, their market share is in the low single digits, except for 2 products. One of them is called the Milwaukee Sawzall, and their share is about 80%, and the other is called the Milwaukee Whole Hog. And Sawzall is positioned on a job, which is a tradesman is looking at this wall and realizes, I got a job to do. I got to cut a hole in that wall, and who knows what's on the other side. There may be cast iron pipes, there may be chicken wire, there may be live electrical cables. And when I find myself needing to get that daunting job done, the word Sawzall pops in my mind. And they hire the Sawzall. It was designed to do that perfectly. Every other tool company owns a reciprocating saw, but they don't have a purpose brand that tells people they should hire that product to do that job. And so Sawzall just owns it. The Whole Hog is a right-angled drill. If you need to drill a hole in a tight space, a normal pistol grip drill takes about 12 inches of clearance to cut a hole. And for a poor plumber, if you got to hog out a hole behind a toilet, you don't have 12 inches of clearance. And so when they face that job, the word whole hog pops into their mind. And they reach in and pull out this Milwaukee Whole Hog, which is a right-angle drill. Every other tool company has a right-angle drill, but none of them have a purpose brand. And so Milwaukee, in those 2 areas where they have a purpose brand, have 80% of that market. In every other product category, they've got low single-digit shares. In other words, the purpose brand is valuable, not the corporate endorser brand, Milwaukee. Sony, in a similar way, have 2 purpose brands in their portfolios, the Walkman and the PlayStation. And the Walkman is positioned on a job, which is I just need to escape chaos. And I hire the Walkman to put over my ears. And the PlayStation is positioned on a job. Every other product in the Sony portfolio has the Sony brand on it, but none of them have a purpose brand that tell people when they find themselves needing to get a job that they should buy this. And so they don't dominate any of those other markets. And Kodak has a similar structure. When a company finds itself with a purpose brand, a very valuable thing, it sets in motion a desire to leverage that brand. You know what? We're running out of time, and I wanted to come to healthcare, so let me just skip ahead. That's a great concept. In all humility, we wrote an article in the November Harvard Business Review last year about purpose brands. And if you just send an email if you're interested to c.christensen@hbs.edu, we'll just email you a copy of that. Disruptive innovations enable a larger population of less skilled, less wealthy people to do things in a more convenient, lower cost setting, which historically could only be done by specialists in less convenient settings. Disruption has been one of the fundamental causal mechanisms through which the quality of our lives have improved. This should be somewhere towards the back of the... So we've talked a lot about computers and geography. Let me go after angioplasty. Up through the early 80s, if you had coronary artery disease, you had to be almost dead to be treated. And yet, when you got treated, you went under the knife of the finest orthopedic or cardiac surgeons in the world, and they did bypass surgery on you. It was so expensive and dangerous that most people with partially occluded arteries just didn't get treated. But then these folks developed balloon angioplasty, and what that entailed was just threading this catheter up into an artery in the heart, blowing up a balloon to open the occluded artery. Crummy technology. Couldn't get to the complicated blockages. Half of all patients suffered restenosis or a reclosure of the artery within a year. Originally, angioplasty was performed by heart surgeons. But every time a poor heart surgeon did a balloon angioplasty, they were not able to use that time to do much higher priced open heart surgery, and they just hated it. And so a new population of less skilled caregivers, people that we call cardiologists today, stepped up to the plate. And the cardiologists had always had to refer patients with severely occluded artery to the surgeon who made a lot of money treating their patients. But then the cardiologists realized, hey, I could do balloon angioplasty with a little bit of training. And so they started to do that training, and as they began to move into the angioplasty market, the heart surgeons were so relieved finally to get rid of that business because it was far less profitable than open heart surgery. But them pesky cardiologists, they just kept getting better and better, and the technology became more and more effective. And then you give them stents that they could wire up into just really complicated places, and now drug-eluting stents that can prop those arteries open forever. And invasive care of coronary artery disease has now become so much more affordable and simple and convenient that 20 times more people now receive invasive cardiac care for occluded arteries than was possible under the hands of the heart surgeons. And everybody's better off except the heart surgeons, because almost always disruptive innovations have been ignored or opposed by the leading institutions for perfectly rational reasons. Now the incidence of open heart surgery is beginning to decline, and the heart surgeons are in deep trouble, but everybody else is better off. Now,
Clay?
yes.
Can I just stop you right there? We're supposed to end at 11:50, but if it's okay with you and the group, I'd like to push you till 12.
Okay.
Is that okay? Is
That's
everyone
fine.
okay with that? Okay.
Okay. And if you want to end at 11:50, just leave. That's what my students would do. So I was on the board of one of the big Boston teaching hospitals for about 10 years, the strategy board. And we did a study that concluded that 70% of the patients in our hospital today, 30 years ago, would have been in the intensive care unit. And 70% of the patients in the ICU today, 30 years ago, would have been dead. In other words, on a scale of the complexity of diagnosing and treating a disease, our hospital had become extraordinarily capable of doing unbelievable things. But in the consequence of adding all of that capability and cost to our hospital, we actually had overshot the amount of care that most people with just straightforward disorders who got admitted to the hospital could use in the hospital, and yet they had to pay for all of that. And so in our healthcare system, the government and the reimbursers' policies have been, you know, we got to figure out how to make these hospitals inexpensive. And so let's limit the amount of reimbursement they give them in the hope that it will force them to drive their costs down. Or let's just ask them to spend $200 million on an IT system so they can keep better track of their costs, and maybe that'll help them become more efficient or something. But it's a pipe dream, especially because there are even more complicated disorders at the high end of the market that actually fit their business model and their technical capabilities. So rather than expecting that these folks will become cheap, what we need to do is use our technology, much of which comes from medical device companies and pharmaceutical companies, to commoditize hospitals and doctors in a new market disruption way. So how could we bring technology to outpatient clinics so that we can begin doing in that setting things that historically we had to take to the general hospital? And how could we bring technology to doctors' offices so we can begin doing in that setting things that historically had required an outpatient clinic? And the next one would be, how could we bring technology to patients' homes so that you can do there things that historically had to be done in an office? It's by making less expensive venues of care more capable that we reduce the cost of healthcare, not by expecting the mainframe computer to become inexpensive. And similarly, our general practice, our physicians have just become extraordinarily capable of doing complicated things. And how are they ever going to become inexpensive? Will they take a pay cut? Rather than that, we need to bring technology to general practice physicians so that those people can begin doing things that they had to refer to a specialist, technology to nurses and nurse practitioners so they can do things that historically had required a doctor, and ultimately technology to patients and their families so that they can do that. And again, it's by bringing technology to less expensive venues of care and to less expensive caregivers so that they can do progressively more sophisticated things is the mechanism by which low-cost, accessible healthcare becomes available to more people, not by taxing the current recipients of healthcare to provide expensive healthcare to those that don't have it. And there are some interesting things going on. And again, if you go back to, just by analogy, remember we talked about how diagnostic would commoditize the physician? And that's really the enabling technology that enables those with less training to do more sophistication, is by precise diagnostics technology. When you move things into that kind of a rules-based world, you actually can provide much lower cost care. There's a chain of caregivers that's called the Minute Clinic. Do they have any in New Jersey? You guys are about as regulated as Massachusetts, but they've started out in Minnesota, and these are clinics that open up in CVS pharmacies and Target stores and Cubs supermarkets. They employ only a nurse practitioner, and in my language, there's a sign on the door that says, we deal with these 14 rules-based disorders. Rules-based meaning there's a precise, unambiguous diagnostic and a rules-based therapy for that precisely diagnosed disease. So what's on the list is strep throat, urinary tract infection, sinus infection, pink eye, earaches, mononucleosis, flu shots. Essentially, 85% of the events, healthcare events in the life of a typical family are on the list. You're in and out in 15 minutes, or it's free, and it costs $39 flat fee. And do you remember how on the disruptive chart, back here where the product isn't good enough, the way you define quality is by the functionality or the performance of the product. But when things have overshot, down here, the way you define quality is how fast can I get what I need, how convenient is it to get, and how affordable is it. And so it turns out that these minute clinics are just delighting the customers. Because in our case, where they're not allowed in Massachusetts because the regulations are so tightly controlled by the doctors, if my daughter has an earache, I got to call up the doctor, and the scheduler says, well, I think we can work you in about 2 o'clock this afternoon. So we go there at 2, and it takes us 2 hours to get worked in, and then the doctor looks at her in 15 seconds and said, Katie has an earache. I know she had an earache. And so then they prescribe the amoxicillin, and I walk out, and I pay $135 for the visit. In that world, that is very low-quality health care, because quality is defined in a very different way than quality is defined back there when we're worried whether I've got disease number 1 through 6 that we call leukemia. And so the disruption of healthcare is already well underway, and the transition that will come when self-pay systems, health savings accounts, and defined contribution accounts become more prevalent will cause this flip to happen much faster than we suppose today. In fact, our calculations, I can show those of you who are interested the data. Generally, when a new technology or an approach substitutes for the old, it goes on an S-curve basis like this. And when you're down at the shallow part of the S-curve, you project out in a linear way, and it doesn't look like the new approach is going to be on you anytime soon. But then as the S-curve flips up, the world flips very quickly. So digital photography has flipped out film very fast. And luckily, Kodak thought about it, and so they're there, but Fuji and Polaroid are gone. Well, if you look at this process for the advent of self-pay health savings accounts, right now they account for 5 to 7% of all insured employees. But it looks like the flip is happening so that by the end of 2007, 25% of employees will be cared for under these health savings accounts. And by early 2009, it'll be 50%. And when people are paying for their own health care, except for the umbrella insurance, then these kinds of disruptive innovations will be in great demand. In states like Minnesota that allow nurses and outpatient clinics and doctors' offices to do these things, my guess is that when self-pay becomes reality, people will consume more health care, because you always consume more when it's convenient and affordable. And in Massachusetts, where regulation prohibits that sort of thing, we'll flip to health savings accounts, and people will be mad out of their gourds, because we'll have to pay for inconvenient and expensive health care, and we'll consume less. Anyway, those are just some thoughts about how this might apply to the healthcare industry. And in general, what it implies is there's great growth opportunities amongst the device companies and the pharmaceutical companies if their strategy is to commoditize the caregivers. And great growth opportunities in the new market disruptions that come out, but it probably means that we won't need as many full-service hospitals or as many high-end physicians as historically has been the case. Cat calls or criticisms or questions? Sir.
It's about Pfizer. Some of us actually work for one of the companies that they bought or are currently consulting to them. And I go back to the model that you had with the 3 dimensions with the resources and profit and the process. And could you talk a little bit about how you see there's acquisition of Pharmacia and Warner Lambert and what that whole strategy means for the pharma industry?
That's a great question. I hate to say this, but I'm very pessimistic about the Harvard Business School. So it's not that but I really worry about Pfizer. So when they bought Pharmacia, I think they sensed, and I don't know that this is true, that what was valuable was in the resource column. In other words, the products in the pipeline, and so they integrated the two and vaporized whatever existed of Pharmacia's processes and business model, which is a painful integration. But then the values or the profit model of this huge merged company then changed to make it very difficult for them to prioritize in the development pipeline a product that is not a mammoth blockbuster drug. And so at the beginning of the pipeline is lots of productive discovery, I think, still. But it just can't pick up the momentum to carry it through the process because it's not big enough to make a difference. And in particular is molecular diagnostics of the sort that I described for leukemia become developed for more and more diseases. You know, for example, in asthma, a therapy that works on one patient doesn't work on others. Why is it? Well, it's clear that there are different diseases that to date are not precisely diagnosable. Or why does Prozac work on some patients with depression and not others? I'm sure that we will discover that depression isn't a disease. You know, there are different chemical imbalances. And as we come to be able to diagnose those things, what it means is that the market for individual therapeutics becomes smaller, not bigger. And also what it means is, just go back to my leukemia illustration. What it means historically is that most of the patients in a clinical trial didn't have the disease that would respond to that therapy. And so it required that the trial be massive in scope and long in length so that you could discern the statistical significance of the results. And so the insert would say, well, guys, you know, 39.37% of the patients respond to this therapy and the others don't. Well, why is it? It's because they had another disease, and we just never thought that this was actually an opportunity to develop a precise diagnostic. And so the scale and scope required to deal with the clinical trials in a world of imprecise diagnosis mandated that the pharma companies get bigger and bigger and bigger so they could. But with precise diagnosis, then you can actually have a very small trial knowing that everybody in the trial has the same disorder, and you'll get a very quick go, no-go result. And so I think that in all of the mergers, they're swimming in the wrong direction. That in the future, the markets will be smaller, the individual product market's smaller, and the requirements for clinical trials and other things will be smaller. And to add to the pain, I really think that the diagnostics technology, often coupled with the therapeutic, tied to like the Genentech Herceptin for that particular, you know, we used to think breast cancer was a disease, but it's not a disease. It just was a geographical location in which a number of different diseases occurred. But Herceptin that is targeted to that disease is really a diagnostic and a treatment together. So in the past for the pharma industry, diagnostics have been a dog business. But I bet you in the future that's where the life will be. And I just don't see the big pharmaceutical companies catching any of those waves, again, for perfectly rational reasons.
Clay, I'm going to take the last question. Wrap this up. For us innovators, entrepreneurs among us, where do you find the greatest disruptive opportunities besides healthcare?
Boy. In almost every industry, you see this opportunity to commoditize the expertise of leaders. So in higher education, we talked about the disruption of business schools. Community colleges are disrupting four-year colleges. They've taken off at a much lower cost structure the first 2 years, and then they just transfer the credits to the higher cost institution, and community colleges are booming. And so the technology that enables instructors in that context to do more sophisticated things is really a great growth opportunity. In airlines, the regionals like SkyWest, and then air taxis, that will be enabled by Eclipse Aviation's planes is, I think, a really exciting growth opportunity. In financial services, W.R. Hambrecht's online auctions by the Dutch auction method of doing IPOs, I think is an exciting growth opportunity for those guys to disrupt the investment banks. What others? Flash memory is a disruption for disk drives. Is actually, you know, we're right in the middle of this. I'm just going down the list of companies that I have in my Charles Schwab portfolio. Sonocyte is a company that makes handheld ultrasound equipment so that personal care physicians, in the past, you had to listen to see if something was wrong to the heart, and you had to feel in the tummy to see if something was wrong there, or you had to feel to see if there's a growth on your thyroid, you know. And now with a little Sonocyte ultrasound, you just look inside the body. And that's a great growth opportunity in healthcare. And anyway, there are lots of them.
Okay. Thank you.
It's depressing for the established leader, but always there's more growth on the other side. The disruption of healthcare is already well underway, and the transition that will come when self-pay systems, health savings accounts, and defined contribution accounts become more prevalent will cause this flip to happen much faster than we suppose today. In fact, our calculations, I can show those of you who are interested the data. Generally, when a new technology or an approach substitutes for the old, it goes on an S-curve basis like this. And when you're down at the shallow part of the S-curve, you project out in a linear way, and it doesn't look like the new approach is going to be on you anytime soon. But then as the S-curve flips up, the world flips very quickly. So digital photography has flipped out film very fast. And luckily, Kodak thought about it, and so they're there, but Fuji and Polaroid are gone. Well, if you look at this process for the advent of self-pay health savings accounts, right now they account for 5 to 7% of all insured employees. But it looks like the flip is happening so that by the end of 2007, 25% of employees will be cared for under these health savings accounts. And by early 2009, it'll be 50%. And when people are paying for their own health care, except for the umbrella insurance, then these kinds of disruptive innovations will be in great demand. In states like Minnesota that allow nurses and outpatient clinics and doctors' offices to do these things, my guess is that when self-pay becomes reality, people will consume more health care, because you always consume more when it's convenient and affordable. And in Massachusetts, where regulation prohibits that sort of thing, we'll flip to health savings accounts and people will be mad out of their gourds because we'll have to pay for inconvenient and expensive health care and we'll consume less. Anyway, those are just some thoughts about how this might apply to the healthcare industry. And in general, what it implies is there's great growth opportunities amongst the device companies and the pharmaceutical companies if their strategy is to commoditize the caregivers. And great growth opportunities in the new market disruptions that come out, but it probably means that we won't need as many full-service hospitals or as many high-end physicians as historically has been the case. Cat calls or criticisms or questions? Sir.
It's about Pfizer. Some of us actually work for one of the companies that they bought or are currently consulting to them. And
yeah.
And I go back to the model that you had with the three dimensions with the resources and profit and the process. And could you talk a little bit about how you see there's acquisition of Pharmacia and Warner Lambert and what that whole strategy means for the pharma industry?
That's a great question. I hate to say this, but I'm very pessimistic about the Harvard Business School. So it's not that but I really worry about Pfizer. So when they bought Pharmacia, I think they sensed, and I don't know that this is true, that what was valuable was in the resource column. In other words, the products in the pipeline, and so they integrated the two and vaporized whatever existed of Pharmacia's processes and business model, which is a painful integration. But then the values or the profit model of this huge merged company then changed to make it very difficult for them to prioritize in the development pipeline a product that is not a mammoth blockbuster drug. And so at the beginning of the pipeline is lots of productive discovery, I think, still. But it just can't pick up the momentum to carry it through the process because it's not big enough to make a difference. And in particular is molecular diagnostics of the sort that I described for leukemia become developed for more and more diseases. You know, for example, in asthma, a therapy that works on one patient doesn't work on others. Why is it? Well, it's clear that there are different diseases that to date are not precisely diagnosable. Or why does Prozac work on some patients with depression and not others? I'm sure that we will discover that depression isn't a disease. You know, there are different chemical imbalances. And as we come to be able to diagnose those things, what it means is that the market for individual therapeutics becomes smaller, not bigger. And so, and also what it means is, just go back to my leukemia illustration. What it means historically is that most of the patients in a clinical trial didn't have the disease that would respond to that therapy. And so it required that the trial be massive in scope and long in length so that you could discern the statistical significance of the results. And so the insert would say, well, guys, you know, 39.37% of the patients respond to this therapy and the others don't. Well, why is it? It's because they had another disease, and we just never thought that this was actually an opportunity to develop a precise diagnostic. And so the scale and scope required to deal with the clinical trials in a world of imprecise diagnosis mandated that the pharma companies get bigger and bigger and bigger so they could. But with precise diagnosis, then you can actually have a very small trial knowing that everybody in the trial has the same disorder, and you'll get a very quick go, no-go result. And so I think that in all of the mergers, they're swimming in the wrong direction. That in the future, the markets will be smaller, the individual product market's smaller, and the requirements for clinical trials and other things will be smaller. And to add to the pain, I really think that the diagnostics technology, often coupled with the therapeutic, tied to like the Genentech Herceptin for that particular, you know, we used to think breast cancer was a disease, but it's not a disease. It just was a geographical location in which a number of different diseases occurred. But Herceptin that is targeted to that disease is really a diagnostic and a treatment together. So in the past for the pharma industry, diagnostics have been a dog business. But I bet you in the future that's where the life will be. And I just don't see the big pharmaceutical companies catching any of those ways, again, for perfectly rational reasons.
Clay, I'm going to take the last question. Wrap this up. For us innovators, entrepreneurs among us, where do you find the greatest disruptive opportunities besides healthcare?
Boy. In almost every industry, you see this opportunity to commoditize the expertise of leaders. So in higher education, we've talked about the disruption of business schools. Community colleges are disrupting four-year colleges. They've taken off at a much lower cost structure the first 2 years, and then they just transfer the credits to the higher cost institution, and community colleges are booming. And so the technology that enables instructors in that context to do more sophisticated things is really a great growth opportunity. In airlines, the regionals like SkyWest And then air taxis that will be enabled by Eclipse Aviation's planes is, I think, a really exciting growth opportunity. In financial services, W.R. Hambrecht's online auctions by the Dutch auction method of doing IPOs, I think is an exciting growth opportunity for those guys to disrupt the investment banks. What others? Flash memory is a disruption for disk drives. Is actually, you know, we're right in the middle of this. I'm just going down the list of companies that I have in my Charles Schwab portfolio. Sonocyte is a company that makes handheld ultrasound equipment so that personal care physicians, in the past, you had to listen to see if something was wrong to the heart, and you had to feel in the tummy to see if something was wrong there, or you had to feel to see if there's a growth on your thyroid, you know. And now with a little Sonocyte ultrasound, you just look inside the body. And that's a great growth opportunity in healthcare. And anyway, there are lots of them.
Okay. Thank you.
It's depressing for the established leader, but always there's more growth on the other side.
Well, thank you, Clay, very much for coming today.